Hey, good morning. I'm Patricia Murphy. It's Tuesday. This is Seattle Now. 20 years from now, neighborhoods like Madrona, Wedgwood, and Magnolia could be a lot more dense. On Friday, the Seattle City Council approved a blueprint for future growth, which allows developments as big as 6 units in residential neighborhoods.
No one forces anyone to sell their house. This is not eminent domain here. So for there to be change, a neighbor of yours has to choose and make a rational financial decision for their own personal benefit to sell the house. And only then might you see change.
Seattle Times reporter David Croman joins us in a minute to break down the city's comprehensive plan. But first, let's get you caught up. The Seattle City Council will take up new rules for commercial e-cargo bikes today. It's all part of the city's plan to incentivize greener options for businesses. Among other things, the ordinance will define where commercial e-cargo bikes can park and unload. The Seattle Times reports that any licensed business can get an e-cargo bike permit for $100. The meeting starts at 2. University of Washington students head into their new quarter this week. Fall classes start tomorrow. An estimated 7,200 freshmen are in the class of 2029. This year is the first for the university's new president, Robert Jones. And you have the rest of the week to check out the local Sightings Film Festival at the Northwest Film Forum. The festival is hyper-local to the PNW. This year is its 28th anniversary. Catch feature-length and short films through Sunday. This year, the fest is fully in person. Check back for more headlines on tonight's episode of Seattle Now. How will Seattle grow over the next 2 decades? The city's roadmap for density took a big step forward on Friday when a city council committee approved the comprehensive plan. It creates 30 neighborhood centers throughout the city where denser housing could be built. The final plan came after months of back and forth and lots of thoughts from members of the public.
It pains me to see the loss of trees, particularly in Southeast Seattle, where communities already face inequities in health and environmental access.
I'm tired of my family, my friends, my community being torn apart and priced out.
Say no to the city overreach of our community's character that would destroy the very charm that attracted us to our respective neighborhoods.
Here we are back to the age-old question about tree preservation and density and affordable housing. We need to have all of them together, and we are not on the right path so far.
Right path or not, the city's growth plan accounts for 120,000 homes to be built over the next 2 decades. Seattle Times reporter David Croman is here to break it down and tell us what it means for the future of housing in Seattle. David, good to see you. Thanks for coming in.
Thanks for having me.
So let's start with the big picture, the comprehensive plan. Sort of a wonky sounding thing, but it's massively important. Clue listeners in, what is it?
It's basically, it says, here's how many people we think are going to move here over the next 20 years. Here's how many jobs we think are going to be created over the next 20 years. And so you have to come up with a plan for how you're going to deal with all of that. So a lot of things go into that, including, transportation and to an extent, school districts. But for the purposes of City Hall and the Seattle City Council, the kind of main topic is housing and where to build it.
Okay. We are also simultaneously with this comprehensive plan attempting to comply with state law. Let's talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, it's kind of all falls under the umbrella for the purposes of this conversation of comprehensive plan. But you're right. It is really 2 different things. There's the plan for growth, but also the state is now saying, look, cities, we think you have not built housing quickly enough. We are going to mandate that you allow more density, particularly in what used to be known as single-family neighborhoods, places where there's mostly residential housing. And so that was decided in 2023, which really kind of dictated the conversation for places like Seattle, basically saying, we're taking this out of your hands, Seattle. We are mandating that you have to put housing in all of these places. And so part of this conversation that's been happening over the last year plus has been how Seattle comes into compliance with those mandates.
Okay, so that is how the table's set. What does the plan call for?
The kind of baseline major takeaway is that compliance with the state, which says you have to put more density in places that used to just be single-family homes. So Seattle, and it'll be a little weedy here, but Seattle, were currently allowed to build up to 3 units per single-family lot. Usually that's 1 main house and 2 accessory dwelling units. This new law says you have to allow a minimum of 4 units And then if you build affordable housing or you're near transit, that can go up to 6 units. So that's the kind of baseline change, which is basically we're going from 3 units to up to 6 units across all of Seattle's residential neighborhoods.
Okay.
The other piece then is what Seattle is layering on top of that. And this is Mayor Bruce Harrell's kind of big policy swing, are these new neighborhood centers. So that's looking at small commercial areas around the city that you and I know and love, which are, stretches maybe in Madrona or Madison Valley or Maple Leaf or wherever. Choose your kind of small business area. This is saying around those, basically within walking distance of those neighborhoods, you have to allow up to 5-story tall apartment buildings, which, I think as far as what people could potentially actually notice in as far as a difference, that's probably the most dramatic, because in a lot of these places, it's only single family homes right now. And so the difference between, of course, a single family home and a 5-story apartment building could be fairly dramatic looking.
So where is this growth likely to get funneled? Give us an example of what it could look like, David.
Yeah, I think one good example is say a neighborhood like Madrona. If you've been there, it's got sort of a small town feel. It's this strip of businesses, very nice restaurants. I think there's a Molly Moon's there, some bars. And then if you go pretty much either block, east or west, it's just single family homes. So despite the fact that you are in a major American city, it feels like you're in a small town. So in a neighborhood like this, what could change is you have, instead of those single family homes, you have low-rise apartment buildings. And that could feel significant. I think the Madrona neighborhood is also a good example of some of the fights that were happening over these neighborhood centers. The original proposal, the Madrona Center was going to go another couple blocks in either direction. And as a result of the amendments, it actually got shrunk at the end there. And so I think that's a good example both of the sort of tricky politics of this and also where we might actually see real change.
I want to talk about developers because, of course, you can plan for the building, but the developers have to build it. What are you hearing from them? Are there certain neighborhoods they're eager to build in? What is the climate like for them right now?
I think this question goes beyond what the Seattle City Council or City Hall generally can do, because to an extent, the development environment is just not particularly good right now. And so my colleague Heidi Groover a while ago had written about, basically had reached out to developers and said, here come these changes, particularly in the single family homes. What do you think? And they almost unanimously told her that do not expect any kind of major building bonanza right away. I don't know if that necessarily applies to the neighborhood centers, because the difference between a single family home and a 5-story apartment building is maybe significant enough that someone could see an opportunity or a profit there. But as far as density showing up in single family neighborhoods across the city, the fact that interest rates are what they are right now, the cost of construction supplies are what they are right now, there's a lot of uncertainty in the economy. If you look at the number of permit applications moving through the Seattle city government right now, it's falling off a cliff. People are not applying to build stuff right now. And I don't think going from 3 units per lot to 4 units per lot, possibly up to 6, is really going to be the thing necessarily that spurs that growth. But if you look 10, 20 years out, that's kind of where things can and probably will change over that period. And so maybe we see another development boom. And when that comes along, developers might be in a better position to take advantage of it. So I think the way of thinking about it is this change is not, at least in the short term, likely to spur new development. But when it gets to a point where developers are more eager to build, it will allow for them to go bigger than what they could previously.
All right, really important context. It may not spur development, but it definitely spurred a lot of feelings. Leading up to Friday's vote, there were a lot of components of this plan still being hashed out, including which neighborhoods would even be included. Where were the biggest battles and how did they play out, David?
So because the state, I think, kind of answered a lot of the most controversial questions around zoning and single-family neighborhoods, what was left was these fights over the sort of things that are trying to balance, quote, neighborhood character with what is actually going to get people to build it. And so that is boundaries of these neighborhood centers. Where exactly do you draw the boundaries? And there were pretty big fights over, do you include this block? Do you exclude this block? Is this an environmentally protected area? Is it not? So that was kind of one of the big fights, is exactly how big and what should these neighborhood centers encompass. The other piece was sort of around how much of a given lot you're allowed to use. So say you're allowed to build 4 new units on a lot, but how big can those be? How much of the lot can they take up? How far back from the sidewalk or the street should they be? How big should the front yards be? That sort of question. So that was kind of a big fight. And then really where we saw some of the most impassioned responses was around trees. So there's this conversation happening around, Seattle's tree canopy. And of course, the government has control over trees on public land, but this is this question of how much control should Seattle government have over trees on private land? So if you are a developer and you buy a lot and you've got some big cedar tree on it, what is your obligation to that tree? There's an extreme spectrum here where on the one hand you have, cut down all the trees to maximize housing. On the other hand is never build another new unit of housing ever to save all the trees. Those are not sort of the realistic responses or, positions that people were taking. But there was sort of a fight over how much give and take between those two things. I think it sort of landed somewhere in the middle, maybe sort of leaning towards tree protection. So it didn't maybe go as far as some developers and urbanist types would have wanted to get rid of barriers to build housing. I also don't think it went as far as some tree advocates wanted to save the trees. So that ended up being one of the biggest fights.
Okay. Where do you think urbanists landed at the end of the day here?
Compared to other cities across the country and within Washington state, Seattle's plan is more conservative. I'll say that. And certainly compared to the state legislature and what they're doing. If you look at places like Spokane, for example, or other places, there are conversations around eliminating, say, parking requirements. So this isn't eliminating parking per se, but eliminating the requirement that you have to build parking. And for urbanists, this is a big deal because if you don't have to build parking, the idea is you can build more housing in that place, maybe drive down costs. There was a proposal to do that in Seattle, and it was rejected. There was another proposal to add more neighborhood centers that was turned down. And so if you compare this just to other cities in Washington state, Seattle did not go as far as it could have. At the same time, I think these neighborhood centers are a fairly significant change and is further than what the city was required to do under the state. So by that metric, what they're required to do versus what they opted to do, Seattle did go further in that respect.
There was a lot of public comment leading up to this vote on Friday. A lot of people from single-family neighborhoods not in favor of this. Where did they land after all this? People who fought against more density.
I think through this whole debate, there was an acceptance both from the Seattle City Council and I think from a lot of commenters that density is happening. I think, again, because the state has said that it's going to happen. That was taken out of the city's hand. There is no wiggle room there. Density is coming to Seattle. And so that is why I think a lot of the fights ended up being around trees and neighborhood character and these neighborhood centers, because that is where the city had the most latitude. And it's a housing debate. Nothing like housing gets people's passions as riled up. And so, of course, people are going to be dissatisfied on both ends of the spectrum. And I think that is the case in this one.
Yeah. And neighborhood character can mean a lot of things.
It can mean a lot of things. It can be a genuine concern about sort of what the aesthetics are and the relationships you have with your neighborhoods. I think it can also be a bit of a red herring for just trying to avoid growth altogether.
What else do you think people should know about this plan?
You're probably going to see more corner stores and not even necessarily on corners.
Bodegas.
Yeah, exactly.
Yes,
That's the idea.
I'm looking forward to that.
That was one piece of this plan, was allowing more corner stores. And then again, an amendment that happened was those corner stores don't literally have to be on corners anymore. So it might be, on blocks, residential streets. Though there was another proposal to allow more restaurants and bars in those spaces, and that was rejected. So you might see more bodegas. You probably will not see more bars in your neighborhoods. And then also, the city government is not done here. They passed a resolution sort of forecasting what they want to look at next. So that includes things like more tree protection or more of these neighborhood centers. So just because they've passed this doesn't necessarily mean it's the end of the conversation.
All right. Seattle Times politics reporter David Croman, really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you. Appreciate you listening to Seattle Now, and thank you for supporting us financially. Today's episode was produced by Andy Hurst. It was edited by Caroline Chamberlain Gomez. Our production team also includes Vaughn Jones, Brooklyn Jamerson Flowers, and Paige Browning. Greg Kramer does our theme music. Seattle Now and KUOW Public Radio are members of the NPR network. I'm Patricia Murphy. See you soon.
Yes, I'm George McFly. I'm your density. I mean, your destiny.